falling apart. There's a war here, terrible environmental disaster there. Everybody hates each other and you get kind of depressed.
Over the last couple of generations, a lot has changed. When my great-grandmother was my age in the 1930s, the average lifespan in my country, Sweden, was 62. Today, it's 83. Out of 1,000 children born, 77 died before the age of 5. Today, that number is 2. Back then, there were 17 persons per car. Today, there are 2 persons per car in Sweden. Back then, 1% of adults had a university degree. Today, it's 26%. And of course, society's productivity as measured by the GDP per capita has increased massively.
So the grand narrative now is that all of this development, all of this progress is due to global capitalism. And the best thing we can do is just to let it be and maybe do a few adjustments in the margin.
This is Roland Paulsen, author and associate professor of sociology at Lund University. I sat down with him to speak about what he calls the greatest mystery in medicine and social science right now. But first, we talked about the conventional narrative around growth that you often hear from people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett.
I mean, this is the best time to be alive in the history of the world. I mean, in terms of medicine, transportation, entertainment, you name it, or just in terms of aggregate wealth. Now, the distribution has gotten more and more skewed in recent years, and it should be skewed to quite a degree.
The world has never been healthier, it's never been wealthier.
We have better houses, better cars and tractors. Humanity really does seem to be improving in one area after another. It almost makes you believe in this old-fashioned thing called progress.
This is a narrative that suits everyone who is currently becoming rich at others' expense. And I think the question we should ask now is, what is a good life? Despite all these improvements, which are very real in material conditions, why are we not feeling better?
This is me and my friends from law school, some 15 years ago. I didn't have a lot of money back then, but the funny thing is that I remember feeling that my life was still rich. I was surrounded by friends and I spent my days learning stuff. I later graduated and I started earning money, but did that money make me happier? I'm not that sure.
So according to all the survey material we have, there is a positive correlation between economic growth and happiness. But that correlation only seems to exist up until a certain level. After that level, the correlation flattens out. And in Sweden and in many other OECD nations, we reached that level already in the 1950s.
To explain, if you draw a scale from poor to rich and from unhappy to happy, it's clear that the poorer a country is, the more its happiness is affected by a small increase in wealth. That's why the graph increases steeply in the beginning. But when wealth reaches a certain level, the connection between additional money and happiness seems to disappear. In other words, at a certain level, more wealth doesn't make the country that much happier. I believe this finding is more profound than I think that most people realize. Not only for countries, but also for us as individuals. There are some people though, such as the influential author and cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker, who seems to claim that more wealth essentially always leads to more happiness. But to find support for that argument, they need to use some statistical alchemy. If you take this graph we just looked at and we make the income scale logarithmic, then yes, the flattening effect isn't that clear, and it seems like happiness always increases. In Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, a book that Bill Gates has called his favorite book of all time, Steven Pinker uses a logarithmic income scale. But in my mind, using a logarithmic income scale makes a graph like this completely misleading, and I start to wonder, why is Steven Pinker, Bill Gates and others like them so willing to use statistical tricks to make it look like wealth always leads to more happiness?
Well, I think there are political reasons for that. It's all about just saying, let's go on with the same type of society. Let's just keep everything moving faster and faster, and we'll become happier and happier.
I openly admit to having battled depression and anxiety, and I think a lot of people do. I have problems with depression and anxiety, and I found it difficult for me to be me. I probably had at least half a dozen depression spells that I've gone through. I was all over the place mentally. Every time I had to put on a suit and tie and having to do the role, I was in a fight or flight mode, panic attacks, severe anxiety. Talking openly about mental health problems has become common, but not only among celebrities. Also in my own circles, I have several friends who have struggled with depression, and many of the colleagues that I've met throughout my career have experienced the horrors of burnout. Does this indicate that there is an actual ongoing increase in mental health problems, or is it just that we're more open about them today? Let's look at what the data says.
So we know from mass media, it's being reported all the times, that we see increases in the consumption of say, psychiatric drugs. In Sweden and in the US, around a sixth of the population is taking some kind of psychiatric drugs. In the US, if we just look at middle-aged women, it's around a fourth who are taking some type of antidepressants. We also know that the number of people who are getting some kind of psychiatric diagnosis are dramatically increasing. That we know, but when we talk about the levels of mental health problems in epidemiology and sociology, we are not relying so much on those numbers because they can be affected by all sorts of things. What we rely on is large surveys where you ask identical questions regarding how people feel and see changes over time. The gold standard is the World Mental Health Survey, which is organized by the World Health Organization. They use representative samples, they interview hundreds of thousands of people. The interviews are very long, they can last several hours and be performed on several occasions with the same individual. The World Mental Health Survey is really the most reliable source we have when talking about the actual distribution of mental health problems.
So I printed the most recent report from the World Mental Health Survey, and it strikes me that almost daily the news reports about GDP growth, stock market fluctuations, etc., but we almost never hear about the remarkable results that you can read in this report.
If we look at a single diagnosis like depression, we've seen a global increase with 20% in just 10 years. And if we look at the richest nations and how many would qualify to the most common psychiatric diagnosis, and here I would include depression, generalized anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder. In the UK, in the US and in Australia, it's around 1 in 4 who would qualify for any of those diagnoses. And in Canada, in France, it's around 1 in 5. 1990, depression was the 4th most common cause to ill health. And a decade later, it was the 3rd biggest cause. And by 2010, depression had climbed to 2nd place. In 2017, the World Health Organization reported that the leading cause of ill health globally was no longer a somatic illness, but depression. If we look at the anxiety disorders, which are divided into more diagnoses, if we just put them together, they are actually on number 1. They are more frequent than even depression.
These are obviously astonishing numbers, but things get even weirder when we start comparing these results between high, middle and low income countries.
When we look at physical illnesses, the richer a country becomes, the lesser problems it has with different illnesses. But when we look at mental health problems, it's the reverse. for diagnoses such as generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and psychotic episodes, the frequencies are more than twice as high in high-income nations as in low-income nations. So a richer a nation becomes, the higher levels of mental health problems we have.
These findings, that mental health problems are more common in high-income countries, are also repeated in this major study called the Global Burden of Disease Study, despite the fact that this study uses different sources and other ways of analyzing the data.
All in all, what I really want to emphasize is that this social variation in mental health problems is one of the greatest mysteries in both medicine and social science right now. One of the most common explanations is that of medicalization. That is the fact that we are making more and more normal states into medical conditions that should be diagnosed and treated. But the surveys we've been discussing are formulated exactly to try to measure what's actually going on beyond the scope of psychiatric diagnosing. So they can't be explained away as easily as that. Another explanation is that of increasing inequality. There is strong evidence that inequality affects mental well-being.
In this graph, the horizontal axis sets out how unequal a country is, from low inequality to high inequality, and the vertical axis sets out the percentage of people in the country who suffer from mental health problems, from a low percentage to a high percentage. And if you start plotting out countries on this graph, you will soon start seeing an indisputable pattern. The more inequality a country has, the more its citizens suffer from mental health problems. But, and here's a really important point, in countries with a lot of inequality, such as the US and the UK, everyone suffers more than in less unequal countries. Let me show you a graph that illustrates this. If we zoom in on the unequal countries and we look at the population in these countries, from the poor to the rich, and we then measure how much social anxiety people have, then we see that the poor people have a lot of anxiety and the rich people, they have less anxiety. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, if we zoom in on the less unequal countries, then we see that the rich people in unequal countries have almost as much social anxiety as the poorest people in the less unequal countries.
One of the strongest, probably the strongest correlation, if we look at single variables and mental health, is that of loneliness. And here we see a dramatic increase in how people are living more and more on their own in one-person households, which actually are over 50% in nations such as Sweden. But we also see an increase in the subjective feelings of loneliness, with more and more people saying that they have no close friends.
In an American study, researchers asked people how many close friends they have. In 1985, the most common answer was 3 close friends. 20 years later, the most common answer was 0 close friends.
So there are some studies indicating that if you have no close friend, the likelihood that you will have depression is more than 50%. Another explanation, work and the changes in work, how much meaning we feel in work, has also changed dramatically. We've had a more than tenfold increase in productivity just during the 20th century. And what that means is that what used to require 10 people can now be produced by just 1 person, and that's in Sweden and most of OECD nations. What that means is that in order to retain a stable level of employment, we have to invent new jobs. And these are jobs that earlier generations didn't need. Here we see a lot of indications that people are feeling a lack of meaning in what they are doing. A way of measuring that is just to ask straight on, do you feel that you're making a meaningful contribution in your job?
And in nations like the Netherlands and the UK, As many as around 40% answer no.
That, together with the fact that precarity is increasing, another factor is the consumption of screen time. There is a correlation between mental well-being and how much time we spend looking at screens, but it's not a very strong correlation, and here we have to look more carefully into what we're actually doing on our screens. Another explanation is that of the mean world syndrome, the fact that our news tend to focus on negative events.
We have so much information from all around the world. It seems as if the world is falling apart. There's a war here, terrible environmental disaster there. Everybody hates each other and you get kind of depressed.
A less debated variable is that of how far we're looking into the future, so-called time horizons. We have this Buddhist mantra that if you're living in the present, here and now, feelings of anxiety and worry will just go away. And I think that's true to some extent, but I don't think we've always had the necessity to do a lot of meditation in order to reach that sort of presence. And here we can see historically that how far into the future we're thinking has really increased. So if we go far back, if we go to the hunter-gatherers, and we know this from a lot of anthropological studies, they did not think that far into the future. In fact, they had to repeat the same way of living almost every day in order to gather everything they needed in order to survive. When we have agriculture, you have to plan several years ahead. And when we develop technology even further, and we have nuclear power and nuclear waste, we have to plan, 100,000 years into the future and see, well, how should we take care of this waste? So what this does is to offer more space for us to worry about the future and to calculate risks and think about all the things that might go wrong. On an individual level, it might be very important to accept that now I have feelings of anxiety, now I have feelings of depression, and that might actually be a strong way of countering these emotions. But on a societal level, we don't have to accept that people are feeling more and more anxiety, more and more depression. On a society level, we should really think about, is there anything we can do about this? And not rely on that economic growth would just solve it automatically, because clearly it is not.
I am Andres Acevedo and this is The Market Exit, my YouTube channel where I publish short documentaries about law, capitalism and fairness. I love making these short documentaries and I want to share them freely for everyone to see here on YouTube. But for me to keep doing that long term, I am going to need your support. So if you like what I'm doing and want to help me do more of that, you can help me out by going to patreon.com/themarketexit. That's patreon.com/themarketexit. And of course, you can also help me out by sharing this video with someone, by subscribing to my channel, and by leaving a comment. What do you think is the correct explanation? Why aren't we feeling better? So this video was a real challenge to make because this topic is so important, but it's also incredibly complex. Ultimately, I was able to make this video thanks to Roland Paulsen's brilliant book, What If? And I'm also so grateful that Roland allowed me to interview him. I will now let Roland end this video by saying a few words about his book. So thank you very much for watching and see you next time.
So the book is called Tänk om, en studie i oro in Swedish. In English we've translated it into What If, the New Age of Anxiety. It's not out in English yet, but it will be soon, hopefully. You'll find it in German and in Polish and Hungarian, Finnish and some other languages. The reason I wanted to write it was because this shift that I've talked about in mental health, the increase we see with different expressions of anxiety and worrying, has not been studied enough in social science nor in medicine as I see it. So in the book I try to give an account of what does this increase look like, and also give a few suggestions to how we might explain it, although it's still a great mystery.